Welcome back to Highly Respected. I'm your host, Scott Greer, and today we're, of course, going to have another incredible episode for you guys, so hopefully you enjoy. It's been a little bit of a slow news week over the last few days, or at least in my opinion, of things to talk about. So today we're going to talk about the major news event over the weekend. I can already hear the groans and people being like, oh no, don't talk about it. Yes, we're going to start off with talking about the Super Bowl. Believe it or not, I can already hear the anger and the frustration of some fans out there. Some people may be excited about that, but we're going to talk about that in the context of the mood of the nation right now and where Americans are at. I mean, spending the whole episode complaining about the Super Bowl would not be an entertaining experience. So I'm going to connect this to larger issues that are going on and my opinions about it. So the ratings as I'm recording right now have not been released for the Super Bowl, but Fox was saying that it would have hit records, it would hit a new record of 115 million Americans watched the game this year, which would be surpassed. I believe in 2015 there was about 114 million that watched it, and they're confident that they surpassed it. Based on just like interactions on social media, I saw the most interest in this Super Bowl than any time I've been active on Twitter. And the ratings for the NFL this year have been highest they've been since like 2016, 2015. And even the amount of social media engagement with NFL posts, NFL said that they've been the highest ever. So there's just a lot of more interaction with the NFL. So before getting into the spectacle of the Super Bowl, it's like, why is the NFL so popular right now? As you have to talk about, I've gone over this theme a lot and saying, well, why, 2016, 2017, 2018, it was very common for the entire right, not just dissident right, but mainstream conservatives to say, we are not watching the NFL, we're tired of the wokeness, we're tired of the kneeling for the national anthem, we're tired of, these players not showing love for Trump or love for the president or love for patriotism. We've had enough, and we're going to vote with our remotes and turn off the game. Now, this is a very common view. But now this is not a very common view. This is a very hated view among the right. It's not just simply that people no longer boycott the NFL. It's that the only uniting factor I can see on the right, both mainstream right and dissident right, is anger at anyone who makes jokes or mocks the NFL. It's like I get such angry responses to just jokes about the angriest tweet. The tweet that generated the most controversy last year was my joke about the B-Dubs option, Buffalo Wild Wings option, where it's saying like, here's the path forward is like, we completely ignore politics. We go over to Buffalo Wild Wings and order all you can eat wings, and then we watch the game. And it was just a joke tweet. And I had all these people for a week act like I ran over their dog. And even I did a tweet yesterday about like the joke of like what's going on, like big game on, beer in hand, wings ordered, black national anthem sung, racial division ended, Klaus Schwab seething, white pilled, just a joke tweet. It's not supposed to be that serious. And there was like all these like extremely angry responses to the tweet for that. And it's always like right wingers. It's never liberal. So it's like anytime you do these types of even dare mentioning like, hey, maybe we should not watch the NFL, the most anger you can elicit from our side is that suggestion. So it's very different from 2018. It's not simply that people are watching the game more or more engaged, is that they're very unified in hatred and hostility towards anyone who tells them to not watch the game or tells them, that there may be something wrong with the woke propaganda. Is like they absolutely don't want to hear that. And I've also even seen that it's not just like our side, it's like random trolls on the internet. It's very, even conservative media, I see more and more articles like lambasting people who are attacking the NFL or celebrating various NFL players, which they wouldn't have been doing 4 or 5 years ago. And, I even saw one article. There's this goofy subcon pundit, Shadi Hamid. I've talked about him before, who always tries to be like a centrist and enlightened on these issues. And like, well, conservatives have some points. And I think for one of the playoff games, it was the Eagles, so it would have been the divisional round. It was like a few weeks ago. he was talking about like, oh, I'm in Philadelphia and I'm surrounded by all these Eagle fans. I just feel alienated from this experience. And I saw conservatives just work themselves up into a frenzy to dunk on this guy, which maybe it's like a little bit of a dorky tweet, but it's like, it's not the most aggravating thing in the world. And yeah, it's so, but people worked up about it. And I saw like Red State and a few other conservative sites just had entire articles attacking. It's like, how dare this guy attack awesome Eagles fans? Like, he just doesn't get normal conservatives. And you have to think, it's like, Eagles fans voted for John Fetterman like last year. And Fetterman, as like recent news has shown, is close to brain dead. Maybe not quite brain dead as the official term, but this guy can't even understand speech. So it's like, maybe we shouldn't defend Eagles fans if they're voting for John Fetterman and others in Pennsylvania. But that they felt that this was their calling to do. And you always see this at times. It's like, so there's renewed attention to it. So why is the change from that period of 5 years ago where everyone is agreeing that they should boycott the game, but even though maybe people still watch the game and they still watch the Super Bowl, even though there were fewer people watching the games, ratings did go down significantly during Trump's tenure, and even Super Bowl ratings were not that high. The highest ratings were pre-Trump and pre-Kaepernick doing the anthem protests. But now it's returned. So why is the major change from that time? And even in this time, people want to say it's like, well, the NFL has gotten rid of their woke problem. It's like, no, it's gotten more woke. It's like, let's just look at all the things that happened in the Super Bowl. First big one is obviously the Black National Anthem that they play. And it's just a ridiculous moment because, one, nobody knows this damn song. Nobody knew that there was a Black National Anthem up until George Floyd. This is one of the things that they've imposed on us and told, like, oh, this is a long-standing tradition, just like Juneteenth. It was imposed on us after the George Floyd revolution, and now we have to accept it. And now it's like, oh, it's perfectly normal to have a Black National Anthem. And the whole thing was just like a very magical experience with the type of singing that they were doing and dancing, and all that was going on. It was the first time it was performed on field during the game. I don't know why. Maybe it's like all the COVID stuff. There was a pre-recorded video of it in 2021. This is the third year they've done it. In 2021, they had a pre-recorded video. In 2022, it was outside the stadium for some reason. I don't know. It's likely, I have a feeling there was all this COVID stuff that made it happen rather than any other reason. But this is the first time it was on the field, and there's a ton of attention towards it, and a lot of conservatives are like, what the hell is this going on? But I don't even think, we'll get into a moment about what people think about it. There was that, and then there was an all-female flyover based, let's go. And then there was a lot of attention towards all the sign language people that they made sure were minorities. There was like one guy who was like a Navajo Nation sign language person, and they drew a lot of attention to that. Then there was the multiracial award winners of the Pat Tillman Foundation, or Pat Tillman Scholarship, who were there to do a coin toss, and they had some DMV lady do the coin toss for the team. And then in the end zone, they of course still had, on one side they have "It Takes All of Us," and then the other they had stenciled in racism. And a lot of these guys still had tags on their helmets that was big in 2020, and they carried it on that they could do social justice messages. I think Jalen Hurts had "Stop Racism," or one of the players had "Stop Racism" on the back of helmets, and similar things to like that going on. And in the game, even though this had nothing to do with NFL's programming, is that both the starting quarterbacks were black. The first time in NFL history, there was two black quarterbacks facing each other in the game. There have, of course, been black quarterbacks playing in the Super Bowl for over 30 years. I think the first guy, they kept talking about Doug Williams, and that was late 80s. So they've had this before. And so this is a very woke Super Bowl. I think that USA Today ran an article saying that this is the wokest and blackest Super Bowl ever, and was really rubbing it in conservatives' faces. Even making a point that the halftime show was, probably not as black as last year, where they had like a throwback to 90s rap with all these rappers there, Dr. Dre, Eminem, even though Eminem's of course white, Snoop Dogg. This year they had Rihanna, and appears to be a pregnant Rihanna who is doing some weird dance moves. She kept grabbing her crotch throughout the thing, which is just odd. A statement for what is otherwise, supposed to be a family-friendly Super Bowl, but Stu is that, and they're like, it's a black halftime show. And then even a lot of the players were doing very black dances in the end zone for their celebration touchdown dances. So it was like this experience. So it's not that the NFL dropped the wokeness, it's the NFL became even more woke, and now conservatives have come back and decided to defend the NFL. I mean, the NFL made absolutely zero concessions to conservatives. In fact, they just went the opposite direction, and all conservatives returned back. So why did conservatives and just Americans in general return back to the NFL? Why are there such high ratings? And one is somewhat of a political reason or social reason, is that when COVID happened, people got very distraught and very worried that normality would not be returned. And I think the NFL coming back is a sign that normality is here, is that normal is back, and we want to return to that because we miss it from what was taken away from us in COVID. And this is a widespread feeling about like life in COVID, and people still have memories of it. I think the fact that all these restrictions have been lifted, especially in 2022, I think that led to more people being fine with the status quo. The status quo is not making them wear a mask everywhere they go, is being a little bit more accommodating if they don't want to get vaxxed, if it's not forcing their kids to cancel school or sit outside to eat lunch. To prevent the spread, which a lot of schools were doing, like the ridiculous stuff they were doing in schools was outrageous. And now that a lot of that stuff is over, and I think people are like, wow, it's good to be back to pre-COVID time. And people feel that way. And a way for them to remind themselves that we're in the pre-COVID time is how engaged they can be in with football and other pro sports. And just like nobody's wearing masks, like everyone's just there and it's something entertaining, and people want to return to that feeling. So, but it's like, why is the NFL the choice? I think another reason is sports betting has just taken off over the last 2 years. And that has brought a lot of men back into the game to follow along, because tons of guys are now making bets on the game, whether big or small, and it's making them more invested in the experience. I mean, there was even a clip they were showing last night. They were saying it's like Eagles fans, but I think it was just Magic fans. And this black guy's there watching the game, and he sees the Chiefs win, and he attacks the TV, and he's throwing it around. He's like even trying to attack his friends. He's like, I had so much money on this game. I had so much money. They lost me a ton of money. And I think there's a lot more reason that you see more clips of people attacking TV and flipping out over games, is because these guys are throwing a lot of money on the line to bet on these games, and are losing a lot of money in the process. So sports betting probably explains, and it has developed over the last 2 years. That probably explains the increased viewership of the game, and people prefer betting on the NFL more than any other sports. I think that's another reason. There's a couple of other reasons is that people have returned, and also conservatives are involved in sports betting, or at least the young conservatives. Barstool Sports was just supposed to be the non-woke sports media empire, is all in sports betting, and so is every other sports media outlet. It's all about sports betting now, and NFL is the king of that. Third reason, I think the game has improved, that they have now more young stars to replace the older generation of all the top quarterbacks in the 2000s. If you look at when the Trump era, is that a lot of these older quarterbacks are still the stars of the game, which it keeps people around, but I think people were wanting young blood in the game, and like more quarterback battles and those type of dramatic contests. And I think you've been seeing a lot more of that with a lot of these very young quarterbacks who are all in their mid to early 30s, or mid to early 20s rather, who are in the game and are now dominating the sport, and all the old quarterbacks who were big in the 2000s have now mostly retired. Tom Brady, Roethlisberger, Drew Brees, Phillip Rivers, all those type of guys. Eli Manning, Peyton Manning. All those guys are gone now, and now there's a whole new generation. And I think people are tuning in to watch these guys like Trevor Lawrence, Mahomes, Justin Herbert. There's a bunch of these guys that they're into. Jalen Hurts is another. So that's another reason I think that the Super Bowl is going to have high ratings, is that these two two, star quarterbacks facing off against each other. Eagles have a big fan base. Unfortunately, you would know that if you have ever lived in the DC area. There's a ton of Eagles fans here. So there's more stars for them to bring in viewers to watch the games, I think. I mean, yeah, they had the stars back, a few years ago, but now they have these, I guess, new and exciting stars that and more spread out among these teams, so people want to come back to the game for that. Other reasons for this, I think are what the media form that conservatives want to boycott now is Disney rather than the NFL. Even though ratings started going up in 2021, I think before conservatives really settled on Disney as their main enemy. 2022 is when they definitely set on Disney as their main cultural enemy and wanting to boycott. And people have been talking about, well, we've seen, the number of subscribers to Disney Plus getting reduced and all that. They due to wokeness, it's like get woke, go broke, which actually I saw a reasonable explanation for why Disney Plus subscriptions are going down. And it likely has nothing to do with conservative boycotts. It's due to the fact that they lost rights to stream the Indian Premier League cricket, which you may laugh, you're like, who the hell watches cricket? But among South Asians, it's their NFL. They love cricket, and the fact that the Disney Plus no longer has the streaming rights to that particular league, they've lost subscribers due to that. And it's international too, so it's a lot due to these South Asians dropping their subscription and going to whatever other service is streaming that cricket league. So that's probably more due to the reason. I mean, conservatives are putting a lot of pressure on them through state power, as people like to say, in Florida and elsewhere, and there's a lot more scrutiny of them. So Disney has become turned into the real cultural enemy of conservatives rather than the NFL, and there's a couple of others too that have moved over, and so that's another reason, and a bigger reason, and a probably bigger reason I think that also comes is that I think for why people are turning to the NFL is that people are less bothered by this stuff, are less bothered by stuff that they would have been, 5 years ago than they are now, especially when they can see what's on children's television. I mean, if you've been seeing all these crazy clips from the Proud Family, which was a popular cartoon in the 2000s, and now they rebooted it, and it's insanely woke. I think most people have seen this. Like, they had a whole segment supporting reparations, a whole segment just supporting tearing down white statues. Another really funny segment they had where they were criticizing interracial dating, which it's like, they might be a little key that they're doing. It's actually coming from the standpoint of black women, which is black women are allowed to be opposed to interracial dating, but that's the only group that's allowed to be opposed to it. Now, of course, whites can't publicly state that stuff, and that's really what the show is coming from, but it is still a funny clip. And so you see, and there's like this stuff from Velma and all these other TV shows that are around that is like more woke stuff, but it's even in conservative shows, or shows that conservatives love, like Yellowstone. And in this show, Yellowstone, there was this clip that was being passed around where it shows this Indian professor walks in, and there's these whites who are like, "Oh, are you the teacher's assistant?" She's like, "No, I'm the teacher." And then there's like a white guy's like, "Oh man, I saw this clip begin on Pornhub. This is how it is." And then this guy's like a blonde-haired Chad, like a frat bro type dude, and she's like spends her whole time humiliating. He's like, "What's your like?" I think his name's like Trevor. And she's like, or Trent. And she's like, "Trent, do you know what power is? Power is me expelling you from school and getting you suspended. That's real power." But that's what white people have had all this time. And they've used that power to exterminate my people. And she's like a very light-skinned Indian. You would not know she's Indian until she said she's Indian. And she has very white features. And the whole time she's like destroying white privilege, and how she's like, all this history you've been taught has been supporting white supremacy and the dominant culture, but my history is not going to be thought about that. It's going to be Howard Zinn, like, she doesn't say Howard Zinn, but it's going to be people's history of the United States, 1619 Project style. And conservatives absolutely love Yellowstone. They always say, like, this show shows that how anti-woke programming or non-woke programming is so popular, and there's still woke shit in this. And there's like another clip of her like being harassed in a store where these bigoted whites say like you're stealing stuff, and she's like, obviously, and I'm not. I don't know if whites have ever suspected Indians of stealing stuff, but maybe out in Montana and those places, maybe that happens. I don't know, but the whole clip is, if it was blacks, I would understand, because there is like people when blacks go into stores and they get followed around. I do believe that, but well, then again, that's just people basing that on pattern recognition. So even the stuff like Yellowstone has this woke stuff that, like, 5 years ago, if you saw that clip from Yellowstone, people were like, this is woke garbage, boycott Yellowstone. And now every conservative outlet is like praising all the Yellowstone offshoots and how everyone needs to watch them and support Yellowstone because it's like hitting back at woke culture. So they've just grown to accept this stuff. And I think one time you're seeing a lot of chatter online of people, getting upset by the Black national anthem. Lauren Boebert was criticizing it. I think Charlie Kirk was criticizing it. People of that stature were criticizing it. But I think outside the online right, I think most people will be like, well, this is a little weird and I'm not familiar with this. But, it's just like, I just want to watch the game. That's like, it's not promoting the type of anger that the anthem protests did. And even I think if they did anthem protests now, I don't think they would elicit anywhere near the type of anger they did in 2016 and 2017. Just a completely different country now from just even a few years ago. And when it comes to the matter of the Black national anthem, I can even see like boomer cons. It's not even so much boomer cons anymore. It's more Gen X cons now who drive movement discourse. Is that they come around to liking the Black national anthem, like, oh, I love the singing, I love the R&B and soul singing. They absolutely, white boomers and Gen Xers to a lesser extent, but they still do as well. They're like, oh, love this singing, and they could just like that as well. And then they could be told, did you know it was written by a Republican? And they'll probably be fine with it. It's like, whoa, we're owning the NFL by having this song. I mean, there's still this strong attachment to the national anthem, and they're always going to be weirded out by it because they feel that we should be a nation with only one national anthem, and this is dividing the population. But I think outside of like the really hardcore conservative element, I don't think people are that enthusiastic about it. I think they're just like kind of a confusion and just like, what is this? But it's like, oh well, and then they just stand up. And I think you could see this in an image that came from the stadium, is that Carrie Lake was at the stadium for the game, and she sat down for the Black national anthem. In front of her were these two young blondes who were there, and they were kind of like, they were standing up, but they weren't really paying attention to the song. It looked like they were conversing among themselves. And I think that's kind of like the response, is that people will just kind of awkwardly stand up and they'll just kind of look around, and maybe they'll carry on a conversation they had before. It's not the type of respect right now they have for the national anthem, but it could be in that case. And I think it's just not so much outrage, it's just kind of a shrug. And that's the response towards the Black national anthem. But I think there's so much more acceptance of this stuff. I mean, end racism was stenciled in every end zone and every other end zone for the entirety of the NFL year. They play the Black national anthem at the inaugural game every year. Or I don't know if it's the inaugural. You use the inaugural game, but the first game every year also includes it. All the marquee games have the Black national anthem sung at it. And so they decided to keep all the woke stuff when, like, even the NBA decided to get rid of all the BLM propaganda, the overt BLM propaganda that was on the court side and on players' jerseys. But the NFL decided to carry on with it. So, and they haven't been punished with it. They've actually had the highest ratings ever, or in a very long time for this year. So it's a lot of different. So, I mean, if you're looking overall, I mean, technically, or if you're wanting to explain it from among the general population, I think the prevalence is sports betting. But even for conservatives dropping their desire to boycott or make them pay a price is due to conservatives accepting more of these changes that have happened over the last few years and this desire to return to normal. And I think even among the American population, there's this desire to return to normal. Is that it's very different from the meter of conversations you see on social media. On social media, there's apocalyptic tones and everything, and there's worries that civil war is down the corner and all these terrible things are going to happen. But among the general population, that feeling is not shared. I think if you look in 2020, there's a very dark feeling among the population. In 2016, there was a very populist mood going on. And even during the Trump years, even though there was like a very successful economy, there was like a very fraught social fissures going on in the country. But now I think it's with COVID going away, I think there's just been a lowering of the temperature, and the social mood is very different. It's a desire for the status quo, or being content with the status quo, and it's not. And a lot of people are just tuning out of politics. You can see this by the State of the Union had some of the lowest ratings ever this year, and now you could just say, well, people don't want to listen to Brandon speak. Maybe that's it. But it's also the fact that, like, if you want to look at political involvement and political interest or what's going on, State of the Union is one way to show, like, high ratings to the State of the Union would show the general public that's very tuned in to what's going on in politics. And it had the lowest ratings it's seen ever. And when you contrast that with just a few days later, the Super Bowl having the highest ratings ever, that shows like what the American population cares about at the moment. And they don't care about politics. They just care about things that are escape from politics, even though all those escapes from politics now have very woke messaging and have some political overtones. The American public just wants to engage in entertainment, and it's like fine with just normality and the status quo. And I think that explains why Democrats did a lot better in the midterms, is that just the mood has changed. That people don't just want stability, and they just want to, get back to watching the game and making money and doing their normal pursuits, and they're not at all interested in civil war or revolution or even radical changes going on in Washington. They're just content with what's going on. And even like Biden's speech at the State of the Union was very much an appeal to the center. Some people got mad over if people suggested this. Like, I saw a lot of people were mad at Nick Fuentes for his comments about Biden's State of the Union, which I think some people are always worried that like right wingers will go into the Biden is base meme. There's been a lot of people who've unfortunately gone down that route, which I don't think Nick was saying. And I think even from his statements, I don't think you can clearly tell that's not what he's saying. But people are very sensitive to that. And even in statements he was saying, it's like, if you look at what he's talking about, the economic populist message he's having is like, we're going to buy American. And most of his stuff was just like appealing to the center. It was not trying to be too woke or hit people over the head. He's no longer calling, ultra MAGA Republicans the enemy of the state. He's just talking about how we're bringing manufacturing jobs, the forgotten Americans. We're now going to give them their livelihood back, and we're going to buy American. And like pretty much everyone agrees with that stuff, and it's like pretty popular. And even Nick made this point that's like saying that a lot of people, or at least one of the clips I saw, is that he's saying, people say like all the stuff that Biden says is crazy. And I think a lot of what the left says is crazy to us. But unfortunately, the general population, it's not that crazy. I mean, people have accepted a lot of insane things over the last few years. And within our own corner, we find these things like absolutely outrageous and ridiculous that anyone would believe. But for the general population, they're on a different wavelength from us. And I think you have to realize that if you want to analyze politics, is that I think too many people analyze it from our particular standpoint, our little corner, our little subculture, our little niche, and they don't understand how this goes along with people who are not even like so much, that politically involved, like the centrist independent element, the people who are not really watching the State of the Union, who are not that tuned into politics and how this message resonates with them. I think the one thing is like Biden's message isn't going to be that important. I think people have already moved on for the State of the Union. I'm probably one of the last people to bring up the State of the Union on this Monday, nearly a week after it. But I think when you look at the American public, it is touching into the mood that they feel right now, and it doesn't so much see it as a revolutionary mood or a tumultuous mood. I think it's a real desire for stability. And a lot of people who who see the things that are going around in the world around us, and our side will be very mad about it, from Black National Anthem, all female pilots, and they'll just be like, oh well, who cares? I'm focused on the game. And sometimes it's not even so much a collective shrug, it's like strong support. I think if you look at stuff like gay marriage and gay couples, gay couples being in TV shows, that was like very controversial just 10 years ago, but now it's like in every advertisement, so it's not controversial at all, and there's a lot of support for that stuff. And the only opposition you can really find is on the online right. And I think that's why people gravitate towards it. Everyone's always like saying like touch grass, like log off, and it's the world around you, touching grass, you can really see like the insanity in the world, and maybe sometimes online you feel more sanity there. Even though I'm beginning to worry about like the online sphere's connection to reality. I think they're losing a little bit too much touch with reality, but it's just worth pointing it out. And that's not so much to say as a black pill. I'm just saying that this is the mood for right now. I don't think this mood's going to last forever. There's going to be lots of changes going on. It might not even last for the rest of the year because there's so many crazy things that can happen. I mean, I always wanted to say this about the 2020 election and comparing it with 2024. It is hard to predict what the 2024 election is going to be like. The only thing I can really predict, that unless it's like something catastrophic happens for Republicans, they're probably going to win back the Senate because there's so many vulnerable seats for Democrats and Republicans have hardly any vulnerable seats. It's just shaping up for Republicans to be like that. If they somehow do not win the Senate, there's something that is like the most disastrous election for Republicans in a very long time if that happens. But when it comes to the presidential election and the House election, there's so much stuff that can happen. I mean, it's like predicting in February 2019 what the 2020 election would happen. And this is not accounting for the biggest issues that happened in 2020, namely COVID and the Floyd revolution. Those things completely changed the 2020 election, and anything you would have said about it in 2019 was no longer relevant. It was all about things that happened in 2020, and that could still be the case for 2024. We could hit a really rough recession. There could be, global instability. Something goes wrong that goes counter to the globalist American empire's interests. There could be a massive terror attack or something of that sort, or maybe there's a new pandemic that there's a breakout of. You never know what's going to happen, so it's a little bit too hard to predict what will occur for that election and the social mood. And the social mood could rapidly change in just a year. But I'm just saying, like, at this present moment, February 2023, and probably for most of 2023, this is the mood of the nation. It's seeking stability. It's largely content with the status quo. It may not be enthusiastic about the status quo, but it's just shrugging, and it's getting back to normal life. Getting back to watching the NFL, getting back to watching streaming platforms, normal life, and people are just not that interested in, I think the general public is not that interested in politics anymore compared to they were in the Trump years. And I think Biden, even though he's like having a disastrous presidency in so many ways, I mean, the border crisis is, I think, the number one example you can say about how horrible his administration is. I mean, how they're, we've had well over, including immigrants that they did not catch at the border, we've had well over 5 million illegals come to this country under Biden. And that number is only going to continue to rise. I mean, get even higher. And that's just in 2 years of his presidency. So there's he's been a terrible president, but he is, I don't think through his policies, so to speak, but just how the country is moving, he is in some ways bringing back that promise that he ran on in 2020, unstated promise, which was people voted for Biden to rewind back to 2014. They did not. They wanted to rewind back to a pre-Trump era. They wanted to rewind back to a less political rancorous era, and they wanted to just have a country that has the appearance of stability and where people can just watch the big game in peace and other things that they enjoyed in the pre-Trump era. And now I think, post midterms and all the COVID restrictions lifting, most of the COVID restrictions lifting, that promise is getting restored, even though there's chances that there's still very bad things. I mean, crime went down slightly in 2022 compared to 2021. I think crime could rise, go back up especially if there's more high-profile police shootings, and that encourages police departments to be even dumber. So that could easily happen, and also there's this illegal immigration crisis. But for a lot of people, they're not feeling these effects directly, and they feel life is more normal than it was during the Trump era, and definitely during 2020. So he has. I don't think he has personally delivered that promise, but people have felt that he has fulfilled that promise, and I think he's a much stronger candidate going into 2024. I know that's like weird to say because he's clearly. Has his senile and can barely talk. I mean, even his whole State of the Union, he was like slurring his words and having a lot of trouble with, and he always has like gaffes. Like the amount of gaffes he has in just one press conference is more than any past president, like more than most presidents have had in their entire tenure. But none of that matters, at least to a large segment of the population, because he just represents the boring status quo. He doesn't seem that threatening, even though he is on a lot of his policies. He's a lot worse even than Obama, but he doesn't elicit that type of strong anger and outrage that someone like Obama or even Bill Clinton did back in the 90s. He is just kind of like this doddering grandpa who's there, who says idiotic things, but people are fine with grandpa being there rather than some extremists who may upend things and do radical stuff, which Biden is doing radical stuff, but it doesn't feel radical to the center, at least at this moment. So, that's just how things stand right now. I think they will change. I think they will be different. Probably even next year, I think there will be a lot different situation. But I'm just saying this is the current mood right now. And I think when people are on the internet, indulging in a lot of radical stuff, radical talk about radical solutions going things, or, indulging in like crazy conspiracy theories and everything else. I think this is like creating a greater distance between us and the general public. If like going on to Twitter versus going and talking to ordinary people is like a completely different experience. And I think a lot of people on social media try to pretend that their views and beliefs are shared by the majority of people when they are in fact not at this moment. And I think that just creates a greater realization that you need to realize what the rest of the population is thinking and believing and where they are, and try to get closer to them to push them in the right direction. And even when it comes to the Greer pledge of don't watch the NFL, I'm almost considering dropping it because of how conservatives are just not listening. Anytime I suggest it is brings the most anger. And I think even some people are watching the NFL, are becoming NFL supporters just to spite me. I wish I was being a little, maybe this is paranoid, but I think people are just doing it. I mean, people like half of the right wing, they don't feel they have the ability to influence real world events. So then they just decide to, and they don't even have the ability to cancel liberals or leftists. So they just focus on owning other right wingers to compensate for that and to feel like they're doing something. So deciding to troll Scott M. Greer epic style by talking about how your DraftKings bets, I guess that makes up for political activism. But when it comes to the NFL or dropping it or making a stance against it, I think that time has passed. Maybe it can come again in a few years, but not over the next 2 years. I think the NFL is going to be widely popular and it's still going to be woke, and people want to enjoy it for the entertainment, and people are not going to turn it off. No matter how many people take the Greer pledge, unfortunately. And the only people who are not watching the NFL are I would even say hyper online right-wing people, but even hyper online right-wing people are watching the NFL. So I don't even know who's taking the Greer pledge. So we may even take that under consideration. Maybe it's a defeat of the Greer pledge, but I think it's trying to get people meet where they are. And I am beginning to realize that for the next 5 years or so, conservatives have decided that supporting the NFL is an important part of their identity. They view it as something that everyone needs to do, and anyone who criticizes or attacks it is worthy of their outrage and energy. And that's just the way it is. They don't mind the woke NFL, so it puts to bed this idea that corporation gets woke and then they go broke. No, they get woke and they make more money for a lot of cases. I mean, there's a few examples that counter that, but majority of cases it says the opposite of get woke, go broke. So that's just where we are right now. I don't know. Maybe we'll continue keeping the. I will not watch the NFL and the Greer pledge, but we'll take it under consideration because I do feel whenever I look at the general. This is one thing where there's not a disconnect between the general population and the extremely online right, is that both sides are getting extremely into the NFL and are very sensitive about any mockery or criticism of it, which, like, it is. I don't mind that, but I think it does show that even our side isn't serious about this stuff and isn't going to drop it and just wants to join in the entertainment, and that is what it is. So that's it for that topic. Maybe not the most white-pilling discussion, but it's a very clear-pilling discussion we're having. So before we get into the cognitive elite questions, I've got a few topics to discuss that actually deal with recent articles I wrote on Substack, both dealing with immigration and how to approach them. And they really confirm my arguments. I love it when real world events confirm my arguments. So the first is these riots that broke out in Britain, which there's also been strong protests breaking out in Ireland over immigration and these migrant centers that they're popping up. And I've been very critical of the Irish and Irish nationalism before, and I've been very critical of the Brits. But they are showing up and making a stand against immigration. I mean, with what's going on with Ireland, very left-wing country, hasn't had like a strong nationalist party, hasn't had that much disturbances over immigrants compared to the rest of Europe, and now it's like a number one issue, and there's guys who are fighting migrants who have been accused of doing crimes, and people are very, very mad about this in Ireland, and people are taking the streets and they're making a strong stand. So I'm gonna compliment the Irish here. I think they should get over. I think their national identity needs to be about something more than resenting the English, but I do admire the Irish for going out there and making a strong stand against immigration, and that's something admirable that all Westerners should follow. So that's a good deal for them. But of course, the national leadership is all like, "Oh, this is so racist. This is how terrible could they do this? The real answer is not sending these migrants back. It's more social services," and all that type of nonsense that these guys like to run with. But we all know the truth that's going on there, and what the British are doing, or the Irish are doing rather, is pretty good. But the British, even their immigration is flaring up as an issue. They've had, they had record number of illegal immigrants, which last year they had, I believe, is 45,000, which compared to America, we had 3 million, including gotaways, the ones who weren't detected at the border and detained at the border. It's about 3 million we had last year. And they had 45,000, and that's causing, a whole ruckus. They've also been bringing in a lot more refugees and stuff, but for 45,000 illegal migrants. And there's this, very brewing political battle over this. There's been very contentious town hall meetings where people have just said, we don't want migrants here, we don't want migrants here, and even conservative politicians are like, well, we have to have them. It's part of our British tradition, and but the people aren't happy about it. And in Liverpool last week, I think it was on Friday, they heard a report that a migrant had sexually harassed a girl. And they were so incensed by this that they went and rioted outside a migrant center. And that's like something that you would have only heard about in Eastern Europe a few years ago. And now you're seeing this stuff in the UK. Because there was there was a couple of cases in Germany where, there was a wide, spread sexual abuse going on. Or migrants groping all these women through, there was a New Year's Day event that happened in Cologne. Or maybe it was Frankfurt. I think it was Cologne. And this is 2015, 2016. And there were some guys who went out to confront migrants over it after the fact. But you haven't really seen that. In Eastern Europe, it's very common for the locals to get upset about that. But now you're even seeing this in the UK, which hasn't happened before. And the issue of immigration is really even riling up the British Isles, which don't have much of a... far right doesn't really neither of the British Isles have a real right-wing nationalist party, unlike in France, Denmark, Sweden, elsewhere throughout Europe, and Italy especially. they don't really have a party to represent. I mean, they just have the Conservatives in the UK, and I don't even know if they have. I don't even know if they even any of the mainstream parties even criticize immigration in Ireland. But now there's this popular upswelling against it, and I think you're going to see more of the political class respond to it, or at least you hope so. But there's not that in America. And as I was saying, once again, these guys are taking in a fraction of the migrants we're taking in. I mean, compared to, 3 million versus 45,000 in Britain. I mean, Britain is a smaller country. It's about a sixth of the size of America, I think, about roughly the sixth of the size of America. But they've taken in about less than 2%. They got less than 2% of the illegal migrants we got. But you're not really seeing those protests happen in America. I think one is that it doesn't really affect as many communities as they would get that they would do protests over. I mean, Texas and Arizona, there's cases of that. But what the government, a big reason that these state governments have been bussing out illegal migrants from the state is order to placate these rural communities, because these rural communities, like, we don't have the money to handle these illegal migrants who are getting placed here, ship them somewhere else. So that's why Texas and Arizona are busing these migrants out of the state. Even the new Democrat governor, Katie Hobbs, continues to plans to continue those busings of the migrants, probably because she realizes how unpopular it is to leave them among these rural towns that don't have the services to them. So they're responding to that need. And there's also not the urban population that if they gets into a city population, there's not that urban white working class much anymore who are going to go out and riot over stuff like that. So you just have a different situation like that. And as I go along with it, as I want to say, if the locals are worried about crime, they're probably more worried about magical Americans, are the Americans who have not immigrant Americans, we'll call them that, rather than the immigrants. So if it's like they're worried about some guy sexually harassing a girl and stuff, it's likely somebody different from the migrants. Even the migrants can do that as well. It's when they see crime and those types of nefarious activities that are associated with migrants in Europe, they're associated with a different demographic here. So I think even if you're looking at the riots and protests that are happening in the British Isles, you definitely see that the issue is way more important to Europeans than it is to Americans. I mean, it could be a change here in America, and I think maybe this issue could be the dominant issue in 2024 if Trump makes it so, or maybe another Republican makes it so, and highlights how we're having Camp of the States at the border every day. Maybe that can be changed, but for right now, it's, Americans aren't as worked up about it as Europeans are, as evidenced by what's going on in Britain and Ireland. The second point I want to bring up is another column I wrote that was responding to Joel Berry, Babylon Bee, who is talking about how immigrants could provide the solution. We just need to assimilate them more. And I argued that assimilation may be the problem. Well, that thesis was confirmed by this Vice panel they had with a bunch of Asian Americans, where pretty much all the Asians here were assimilated to a certain degree. I think there was a Taiwanese girl who spoke with a little bit of an accent and likely came from a community where everyone is Taiwanese, and she probably speaks her native language at home in her community. But pretty much all the other Asians, it included South Asians and East Asians, so there was like Indians among them, who were there, were all assimilated to America, maybe to different types of America. A lot of conservatives were highlighting this one guy, Vince Dow, which a lot of people really don't like Vince Dow. I don't know much about him, so I'm not going to speak on that. But all I know is that he was like the lone conservative there, and he was lone guy dressed in a suit, looking clean cut, and talking about how, the dominant white culture is fine and that people need to assimilate that, and just really kind of basic stuff that even liberals would have maybe said like 20 or 30 years ago about like how to succeed in America. And all these fellow Asians who were around him were just like outraged that this guy could be saying these like very basic talking points. And they went off on him. But I mean, he himself, I made the point that, he's likely less assimilated than the people who are criticizing him. But he is like assimilated to a conservative ideal of America. It's like you're clean cut, wearing suits, that type of thing that like a boomer con would be like, that guy probably gives me a firm handshake. And, the type of immigrant assimilationist story that a lot of conservatives cling to, this guy is probably upholding it. But the people who are attacking him are not like clinging to their native culture. They're clinging to a different type of assimilation. And there was this girl who was really attacking him, she has purple hair. She speaks in, I want to say Ebonics because it's much easier to say, but now they prefer African American Vernacular English, AAVE. Inflected tone, and the way she's talking is very much like blacks. And she's talking about like, I hate assimilation. Like, we're not assimilation. We're not assimilating to white culture. You're talking about assimilating to white culture. And you're like looking at her and the way she dresses, like, you're not like embodying, I don't know what particular strand of East Asian she is, whether she's Korean, Chinese, or Japanese, but or maybe she might even be like Vietnamese. I don't think she is, but if I had to guess, it was Chinese, but I may be wrong. And this woman, she's not like exhibiting like native Chinese culture or any native Asian culture. She's like fully American. And so were the other like people who were there who were like criticizing American. He was like Dow was sitting next to a guy who's like a gay bodybuilder. I doubt he's exhibiting any traditional Asian culture. There's another guy who's like a Harvard grad who's like an Indian who's like extremely assimilated to America. And so you're looking at this picture. And I think, as I said, the one other slightly conservative person are saying any type of like, just like objective truth or basic facts was a woman who was Taiwanese and I think came from a stronger ethnic community. And one of the weird things about this rhetoric is that we don't have, or revealing from this story is that we don't have the type of multiculturalism that I think people worried about in the 90s and 2000s when you read like Samuel Huntington and Pat Buchanan's book. Samuel Huntington's book is very much emblematic of this, is that he worried that we'd have a bicultural society, or where there'd be an English-speaking majority, and then there'd be a strong, large Spanish-speaking minority, and they'd have a completely different cultures, and they would not even be able to understand one another. And there'd be even more cultures than just that Spanish-speaking minority. There'd be like a Chinese-speaking minority, etc. And they're very much worried about these immigrants coming here and retaining their native traditions, culture, and language, and refusing to learn the native tradition, language, and culture. We're having something different than that. We're having these new immigrants gravitate and fully assimilate to a new America where they gain status by being a racial minority, and that they can gain more prestige by railing against whites and railing about how white America owes them something simply for being a non-white. And so they are assimilating. They're not speaking Mandarin. They're not speaking Japanese. They're even for a lot of Hispanics who speak Spanish, those are probably the more conservative ones of them. And polls have showed this, is that among Asians, ones who are less proficient in English and are not born here are more likely to vote Republican than Asians who are fully fluent in English and were born here. So you almost wonder, like multiculturalism, like the type of multiculturalism as envisioned by Samuel Huntington, where they have these own little cultural enclaves where they speak a different language from English, where they maintain their native traditions and culture. Those areas would be more likely to support Republican policies and be more conservative than if all those areas became merged within America and they began adopting English and listening to rap music, which is the real assimilation now, is that they always want to imagine that assimilation is envisioned in the conservatives on that panel who are dressing in suits and, clean cut, whatever. they imagine that is that they're adopting Anglo-Protestant ways and values and culture, but in fact, it's more like the purple-haired Asian girl that they're assimilating to, where they come in there and they adopt minority identity politics and that type of agitation, and they believe that they are the Asian Americans, AAPIs, they like to call themselves, are now a minority group on the same way that blacks are, and this is their strong identity, and they use that identity to counter the evil white majority who they need to bring down their power to. Which I think, the less assimilated are, the less they're going to be like AAPI. Like, I'm not that. Well, I mean, they're of course not speaking English, but they'd be like, I'm Chinese or I'm Korean, and that's my identity. And I don't understand like this stuff about crime. Like, someone points a gun at me and it's a black guy. I'm not going to talk about systemic racism causing that. I want that person to not point guns at me. I want tough on crime policies. I want to live in a safe community. And I also don't want to pay for reparations. Well, if they get assimilated, they listen to rap music, they're imbibing in American culture, and they're dyeing their hair purple, they're going to be more willing to support reparations and, blame all crime on systemic racism or white supremacy, even if the guy holding the gun and mugging them is definitely not white at all. So it's an interesting theory. I don't know if you'd go full on multiculturalist, because there is like an annoying factor about that, especially for someone like me. I do, it does irritate me when, I'm around immigrants and, they're not speaking English, and they're, their way they're behaving and their how they're acting out in public is very different from the rest of the country, and they're playing annoying music. And there's like something obnoxious about that. So I don't really want to celebrate that type of multiculturalism or say that that's the solution. But I just pointing out that the less assimilated are, the more likely they're going to be conservative and vote Republican. And the more assimilated these immigrant groups become, the more libtard they are. And so that's that's very different from the white ethnics of the early 20th century, is that the more assimilated they became, the more identified with America they were, and the less ties they had to the old country, the more willing they were to be Republican, conservative, proudly serve in the military, all those things that were taught about for assimilation. Now it's a completely different type of assimilation that's going on. I mean, there's still people who do this, who assimilate into that. There was an Asian guy who ran in Northern Virginia in 2022, Kung Pao or something like that. Or it was like his name was something like that. It's probably not Kung Pao. It's something like it was like a Vietnamese guy, and the guy, I think, was born in Vietnam. He came here as a refugee, and he served in the military, and he's now like very assimilated into what like conservatives want immigrants to assimilate to, and he's voting Republican. There's still immigrants like that, but I think the majority, especially the ones who have elite aspirations, are assimilating to minority America, and that makes them even more willing to want to destroy the old America. So that's an interesting point looking at that panel. And I think even though one thing you have to note about the panel is that it doesn't reflect ordinary people, because the people they brought on are like social media stars, are like those type of people, or people are heavily involved in politics. So maybe they don't reflect the general population, but I think they do reflect a trend among Asian immigrants especially. And one final note about that for lower class immigrants, especially with Hispanics, is that when they assimilate directly into black culture. The Asians are assimilating to what middle class whites are, but they feel that they're distinct from middle class whites. And some of them will embrace like being the same as middle class whites and being more conservative, but a lot of them will want to have resentment towards the middle class whites around them, who maybe, slanted their eyes and said ching chong at them when they were kids, and made fun of them. They now want to, get back at them, and they feel this resentment towards the white majority for feeling different. And I don't think they directly assimilate into black culture. I think it's more of just like the mainstream of America is more black influenced than before. And even white middle class kids are using more black lingo than ever before. But it's not full assimilation to black culture. They're not using the N-word in the way that blacks use it among themselves, are just like saying like full on AAV. It's AAV influence. But with Hispanics, they go full into like assimilating to around black culture. And that's the same with like lower class immigrants. I even hear of like, Ukrainian immigrants and other Eastern Europeans who like are raised in really bad neighborhoods, and they gravitate towards black culture and assimilating into that. So you'll see like some Ukrainian kid with a do-rag and stuff, and that's what they assimilate to. So it's a weird country we have right now, especially with the multicultural element. And so it requires a reassessment of what multiculturalism means and what we think is, if we think that assimilation is the real solution. So that's it for all those topics. And now we're going to get into the Cognitive Elite questions. As a reminder, you too can get the power to ask me questions or suggest guests and topics if you sign up for the Cognitive Elite option at Highly Respected Substack, and that's at highlyrespected.substack.com. And we always have at least one column up published per week, and we have the IQ supplements that are published every week, so make sure to sign up for the IQ supplements if you haven't already. The first question comes from Tom, and he asks, Scott, what do you make of all these UFO sightings and shoot down? I guess he's saying about how they got shot down by planes, and they've been happening up all over the world, and like, what do I make of it? It appears that this, it's related to the Chinese balloon in my opinion. And what's happened is that America's like satellite and radar technology has been changed to account for the balloons because of how much public outcry there was over the Chinese balloon flying over America. And I think that this has been very common, these surveillance technology, both being used by China against us against China. And now America, due to the fallout from the Chinese balloon thing, that now we're having to use more of our air power against these UFOs, but I think most of them are just Chinese spy tech that we're shooting down, unmanned spy tech like the balloon. And so that's probably explains why these sightings are happening. I don't think that they are extraterrestrial aliens. I think that they're just that, this obviously follows the balloon that probably created political demand that Biden's like, I don't want to get hammered over this anymore. Let's shoot them down and let's make a tough stand against China. And now they're shooting them down, and that's what's causing all the UFO sightings and these things getting shot down. I think that's the easiest explanation for it. And so it's not that crazy to think of. So I think that's the answer to it. Second question we got today, these are pretty simple questions because it's asking me questions. I don't know if I have a ton to say about this, but the second question is pretty simple. Comes from Dave, and Dave was asking me, what's my opinion about the Project Veritas drama? And for those who don't know, is that James O'Keefe, main guy behind Project Veritas, is on paid leave, and there seems to be a push to get him out of Project Veritas, which is interesting move since he is the star of Project Veritas and is like the face of it, and now they want to move him out. And what do I make of this? I'm not heavily invested in this story, but as from just an outside perspective, is that O'Keefe is, as I said, is the star of Project Veritas. Without him, they're not going to survive. I don't think they would thrive as an organization. He is synonymous with the group, and kicking him out and trying to find another person is just not going to work. They just have to make do with O'Keefe. I think a lot of this has to do not with any larger political issues, but just like internal drama. Is that, it's a chaotic place to work. The type of work they do is obviously going to lead to that type of chaos. And probably due to some of the work it is that maybe James O'Keefe is a bit of a wild boss. And maybe there's a lot of fierce disagreements that go on in this organization. And you could probably find that in any type of organization. But I think also that they're come under FBI investigation, and that makes people very worried. And they feel that maybe O'Keefe is being too reckless. And they feel that if they just push O'Keefe out, that they can make a more normal organization. But I think what they do, they're always going to be under FBI scrutiny. They really do need risk takers for that type of stuff. And O'Keefe is obviously somebody with a lot of balls. He's willing to go to jail for what he does. And there's very few people like that. And I think without O'Keefe, they're just not going to work as an organization anymore. He is the central focus of it. They can't just make a new group without him. Darren Beatty had a funny tweet where he's like, imagine, Project Veritas without James O'Keefe is like Van Halen without David Lee Roth, and he made all those comparisons. I think it's more like Dio without Ronnie James Dio. I mean, that guy is the central focus of it and the star. I mean, without it, it's like just something else. It's not the same. So I think I don't really take strong sides in this, but I do think just from an outside perspective, I can probably understand the reasons for maybe they wanting it out. Maybe it's they view him as the source of all the chaos and maybe the federal scrutiny they have. But what do they do? They entrap people and do like a citizen's espionage operation. Of course, it's going to invite scrutiny. Of course, it's going to be chaotic. Of course, the person behind it may not be the most 100% like stable fully professional CEO that you want. But I mean, that's just going to be the nature of the organization. And I would probably say it would be best if O'Keefe stays. So I guess I would say I would side with O'Keefe, but I'm not that heavily invested in it. And I don't think for our issues, it's that important either way. But I think if they got rid of O'Keefe, I think it would lead to a decline in the organization, in my opinion. So that's my thoughts on that. And now we've got our third and final question. This comes from Jay. He's got two questions today. The first is a pretty good one. Maybe think long and hard about the answer. So he said, since you had Darren Beattie on your most recent show, I wanted to ask you about something you once said. Darren said this: I firmly believe that with $100 million wisely spent, it is possible to take down America's corrupt ruling class. So my question for you is, what would you do with $10 million? What would you do with $100 million? After paying yourself, of course. First, I would give myself a $10 million paycheck, and then the second, I would give myself a $100 million salary. No, that's not what I would do. $10 million, I think that would be the answer for both. Because $10 million, you would lay the ground. I think one thing that the right probably needs to do, there's two institutions on conservatism that the real right needs to challenge and counter. And those are one is the Daily Wire media empire, and the second is the Koch donor network, the Koch institutional network, which, no one talks about the Kochs anymore like they did in the mid-2010s or throughout the 2010s, but they're still very influential on conservatism, like what politicians get money, what political groups get money, and you would need a lot of money to counter that. So with $10 million, you really couldn't build that type of donor network, but you could lay the groundwork for a media empire that could build up to challenge Daily Wire. Maybe it could be through Revolver, maybe it could be something existent now, but you really need to create something where you have stars that people tune into and they give a message. And in the same way the Daily Wire is. I always want to say this is like Daily Wire, besides Fox News, is the second most influential. And I think the Daily Wire model is more the future than the Fox News model. I think it's easier to replicate that and challenge that for the type of talent we have. Fox News is still going to be around for a lot longer. It's still going to be powerful, but you don't have, that type of talent. It takes, I think, a longer time to develop, and then also you're appealing to a different audience than Daily Wire's. Daily Wire's audience is probably a lot younger than Fox News' boomer audience, and they want a different type of thing. And I think you could easily have a more right-wing alternative to Daily Wire. With $10 million can do to start it off. With $100 million, you could definitely challenge them. But you'd have to debate whether to do with $100 million is like whether you start the Daily Wire media empire style media empire, or do you start a Koch donor network, a Koch donor political network, to have the type of money to support political candidates that are America first, to support political groups that are America first, fund internships and fellowships for these guys who are America first type people to work in conservative groups and conservative media outlets. You could do that with $100 million, or you could build a Daily Wire media empire. I think at this time, It's hard to say what you would rather do with that money. I think there is a problem that there maybe isn't as many. First off, this is all theoretical. I'm not about to have $100 million in front of me, so I wish maybe we could maybe at some point. But if you had, someone offering $100 million, I don't know if how many donors would gravitate towards it, because donors have a lot of them. They're not as bad as maybe people thought they were in the mid 2010s, the donor issue problem, but they're still very concerned with like this Tea Party nonsense of like, just shrinking the government. They're not as worked up about our issues as we would hope they were. I mean, there's a few donors who may be like that, but it's not the majority of them. And so I think even if you build up a donor network, it maybe wouldn't be as effective. But I think if you built up like a true right-wing alternative to Daily Wire, and we're like making animated shows and producing documentaries and all these TV specials and all these things, and also having recognized talent that, instead of like ordinary conservatives turning to Ben Shapiro and Matt Walsh, they're instead turning to Scott M. Greer or whoever you want, or maybe there's a new talent that you'd want to develop from that. I think that would be a lot better. And also just be as like a news site is like also Daily Wire gets a ton of Facebook traffic. I think one of the issues is that how dependent conservative media is on big tech. And if you were real right, you'd have a little bit problems with the censorship, but there's ways around it. So I would say, I would say either of those two things, building a political network or political donor network in the same way that the Kochs have with $100 million, or investing in a media empire. I do think the one problem with a media empire is the censorship, which maybe you wouldn't have. With a donor network, I mean, it's not like it's like, oh, we can't get on Facebook. You can still donate money to these candidates and these like activists to advance your positions. But it's it's a little bit of a chicken and an egg situation where it's, you wonder if these ideas are made apparent first by the media, conservative media, and that pushes these candidates in a direction, or if they're pushed in this direction by who's giving them money. Maybe that's not a chicken and egg situation. That's not a wrong metaphor, I would think. But, it is a little bit of a situation where you have to figure out what's more effective and what we can do the most with. So either one of those things would probably be it. Maybe that's not as exciting. I know some people were like, I would start my own base city or something. I don't know. But I think a lot of those initiatives would not bear as much fruit as what I'm suggesting now. And so that's for the first question. That's something more to think about. I may come back with a different answer the more I think about this in a few weeks. So if I come back with something and I have new arguments, just be on the lookout for that. So his second question is you also talked about China as a rising power. I'd like to ask you to clarify one thing about this talk. You seem to go back and forth between talking about Chinese hegemony and a multipolar world. It seems like most of your critical views were directed at a Chinese hegemony. Is this true? How would you clarify a little if you would see these as the same, as one being better or the worse of the other? Well, multipolar world would say that there's a lot of great powers who are about equal to each other. There's not like an American hyperpower that's like the, absolutely unchallenged power in the world. And so multipolar, which China does not use like we want to be the global power. They say multipolar world because it says like, you'll be free from American independence. Like there won't be this global power dominating you and telling you what to do. And so they imagine multipolar world where these countries would be acting more independently and free of each other. So a multipolar world would probably be used for that. And it would be less onerous, or it's not as bad as that, but I think that's more of an ideal. I think what the real thing would be Chinese hegemony, which would be them displacing America as the preeminent global power, and that would be the situation. Which you could say maybe that's more of a multipolar world, or you could say it's just a unipolar world, but now it's centered around China rather than America. It's hard to say what it is, but I think China having more power and over the globe and over America is mainly what I'm negative towards. I think a truly multipolar world where there's like, America's not dominating the entire world is not a bad thing. I think it's even something that we want to have. But the states that are pushing for this, it's really just instead of replacing, it's multipolar world is a much nicer way of saying Chinese hegemony for a lot of these people, and that's what China wants. They want to be the preeminent global power rather than like, oh, we're all just acting freely and independently. I mean, if in that situation it allows them to establish hegemony. So maybe that's a little bit of a tricky way of saying that. But the multipolar world is what they say publicly and is what a lot of these advocates who are pro-China think. But China displacing us would just mean them as the global power in a unipolar world, but a different state in charge rather than America. And so I don't know about how serious a multipolar world will work because there's really just two major powers. Now, I mean, you could see a multipolar world if like India turns into a real superpower, but I'm a little bit skeptical of that for a variety of reasons. So yes, primarily I am anti-Chinese hegemony. Multipolar world in theory would not be that bad. It might even be better than the current situation we are living with. But I think the most likely situation that would change would be a greater form of Chinese hegemony, which I oppose. So that's my clarification on that. And that's it for today's Highly Respected. That's all the conflict questions. And hopefully you got informed today. Did not get too blackpilled. That was not the intention of the discussion. It was just to clarify topics and inform people. So hopefully everyone enjoyed that. We're going to have a terrific IQ supplement later this week that's going to be continuing Highly Respected's Black History Month special at Highly Respected Substack. So make sure to tune in for that. And so until next time, stay respected.